Welcome to Major Antonio's presentation of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Preface.
If it is of importance to study by what means a nation may acquire wealth and power, it is not less so to discover by what means wealth and power, when once acquired, may be preserved. The latter inquiry is, perhaps, the more important of the two, for many nations have remained during a long period virtuous and happy, without rising to wealth or greatness, but there is no example of happiness or virtue residing amongst a fallen people. In looking over the globe, if we fix our eyes on those places where wealth formerly was accumulated and where commerce flourished, we see them, at the present day, peculiarly desolated and degraded. From the borders of the Persian Gulf to the shores of the Baltic Sea, from Babylon and Palmyra, Egypt, Greece, and Italy, to Spain and Portugal, and the whole circle of the Hanseatic League, we trace the same ruinous remains of ancient greatness, presenting a melancholy contrast with the poverty, indolence, and ignorance of the present race of inhabitants, and an irresistible proof of the mutability of human affairs. As in the hall, in which there has been a sumptuous banquet, we perceive the fragments of a feast now become a prey to beggars and banditti. If in some instances the spectacle is less wretched and disgusting, it is because the banquet is not entirely over, and the guests have not all yet risen from the table. From this almost universal picture, we learn that the greatness of nations is but of short duration. We learn also that the state of a fallen people is infinitely more wretched and miserable than that of those who have never risen from their original state of poverty. It is then well worth while to inquire into the causes of so terrible a reverse, that we may discover whether they are necessary or only natural, and endeavor, if possible, to find the means by which prosperity may be lengthened out, and the period of humiliation procrastinated to a distant day. Though the career of prosperity must necessarily have a termination amongst every people, yet there is some reason to think that the degradation which naturally follows, and which has always followed hitherto, may be averted. Whether it may be, or may not be so, is the subject of the following inquiry, which, if it is of importance to any nation on earth, must be peculiarly so to England, a nation that has risen both in commerce and power, so high above the natural level assigned to it by its population and extent. A nation that rises still, but whose most earnest wish ought to be rather directed to preservation than extension, to defending itself against adversity rather than seeking still farther to augment its power. With regard to the importance of the inquiry, there cannot be two opinions, but concerning its utility and success, opinions may be divided. One of the most profound and ingenious writers of a late period has made the following interesting observation on the prosperity of nations. In all speculations upon men and human affairs, it is of no small moment to distinguish things of accident from permanent causes, and from effects that cannot be altered. I am not quite of the mind of those speculators who seem assured that necessarily, and by the constitution of things, all states have the same period of infancy, manhood, and decrepitude that are found in the individuals who compose them. The objects which are attempted to be forced into an analogy are not founded in the same classes of existence. Individuals are physical beings, subject to laws universal and invariable, but commonwealths are not physical, but moral essences. They are artificial combinations, and in their proximate efficient cause, the arbitrary productions of the human mind. We are not yet acquainted with the laws which necessarily influence that kind of work, made by that kind of agent. There is not, in the physical order, a distinct cause by which any of those fabrics must necessarily grow, flourish, and decay. Nor, indeed, in my opinion, does the moral world produce anything more determinate on that subject than what may serve as an amusement, liberal indeed, and ingenious, but still only an amusement, for speculative men. I doubt whether the history of mankind is yet complete enough, if ever it can be so, to furnish grounds for a sure theory on the internal causes, which necessarily affect the fortune of a state. I am far from denying the operation of such causes, but they are infinitely uncertain, and much more obscure, and much more difficult to trace than the foreign causes that tend to depress and sometimes overwhelm society." Unquote. The writer, who has thus expressed his skepticism on this sort of inquiry, speaks at the same time of the importance of distinguishing between accidental and permanent causes. He doubts whether the history of mankind is complete enough, or if ever it can be so, to furnish grounds for a sure theory on the internal causes which necessarily affect the fortune of a state. Thus, he not only admits the existence of permanent causes, but says clearly that it is from history they are discoverable, if ever their discovery can be accomplished. This is going as far as we could wish, and, as for the sure theory, we join issue with him in despairing of ever obtaining one that will deserve the name of sure. The meaning of the word sure in this place appears to be intended in a sense peculiarly strict. It seems to imply a theory that would be certain in its application to those vicissitudes and fluctuations to which nations are liable, and not merely to explaining their rise and decline. As to such fluctuations, it would be absurd to enter into any theory about them. They depend on particular combinations of circumstances, too infinite in variety to be imagined or subjected to any general law, and of too momentary an operation to be foreseen. That Mr. Burke alludes to such fluctuation is, however, evident from what that fanciful but deeply read man says immediately after. We have seen some states which have spent their vigor at their commencement. Some have blazed out in their glory a little before their extinction. The meridian of some has been the most splendid. Others, and they the greatest number, have fluctuated and experienced at different periods of their existence a great variety of fortune. The death of a man at a critical juncture, his disgust, his retreat, his disgrace, have brought innumerable calamities on a whole nation. A common soldier, a child, a girl, at the door of an inn, have changed the face of fortune and almost of nature." Unquote. From this it is abundantly evident that the theory he wished for but despaired of ever establishing was one that would explain such effects. But the object of this inquiry is totally different. When the Romans were in their vigor, their city was besieged by the Gauls and saved by an animal of proverbial stupidity. But this could not have happened when Attila was under the walls and the energy of the citizens was gone. The taking or saving the city, in the first instance, would have been equally accidental, and the consequences of short duration. But in the latter days, the fall of Rome was owing to permanent causes, and the effect has been without a remedy. It is, then, only concerning the permanent causes, that is to say, causes that are constantly acting and produce permanent effects, that we mean to inquire, and even with regard to those, it is not expected to establish a theory that will be applicable, with certainty, to the preservation of a state, but merely to establish one which may serve as a safe guide on a subject, the importance of which is great, beyond calculation. There remains but one other consideration in reply to this, and that is, whether states have necessarily, by the constitution and nature of things, the same periods of infancy, manhood, and decrepitude that are found in the individuals that compose them. Mr. Burke thinks they have not. And indeed, if they had, the following inquiry would be of no sort of utility. It is of no importance to seek for means of preventing what must of necessity come to pass. But if the word necessity is changed for tendency or propensity, then it becomes an inquiry deserving attention. And, as all states have risen, flourished, and fallen, there can be no dispute with regard to their tendency to do so. However much, at first sight, Mr. Burke's opinion may appear to militate against such an inquiry, when duly considered, it will be found not only to approve of the end, but to point out the manner in which the inquiry ought to be conducted, namely, by consulting history. If it is allowed that any practical advantage is to be derived from the history of the past, it can only be in so far as it is applicable to the present and the future. And, if there is none, it is melancholy to reflect on the volumes that have been written without farther utility than to gratify idle curiosity. Are the true lessons of history, because they are never completely applicable to present affairs, to be ranked with the entertaining but almost useless pages of romance? No, certainly. Of the inheritance possessed by the present generation, the history of those that are gone before is not the least valuable portion. Each reader now makes his application in his own way. It is an irregular application, but not an useless one, and it is therefore hoped that an inquiry, founded on a regular plan of comparison and analogy, cannot but be of some utility. But why do we treat that as hypothetical, of which there can be no doubt? Wherefore should there be two opinions concerning the utility of an inquiry into those mighty events that have removed wealth and commerce from the Euphrates and the Nile to the Thames and the Texel? Does not the sun rise, and do not the seasons return to the plains of Egypt and the deserts of Syria, the same as they did 3,000 years ago? Is not inanimate nature the same now that it was then? Are the principles of vegetation altered? Or have the subordinate animals refused to obey the will of man, to assist him in his labor, or to serve him for his food? No, nature is not less bountiful, and man has more knowledge and more power than at any former period. But it is not the man of Syria or of Egypt that has more knowledge or more power. There he has suffered his race to decay, and along with himself, his works have degenerated. When those countries were peopled with men who were wise, prudent, industrious, and brave, their fields were fertile and their cities magnificent. And wherever mankind have carried the same vigor, the same virtues, and the same character, nature has been found bountiful and obedient. Throughout the whole of the earth we see the same causes producing nearly the same effects. Why then do we remain in doubt respecting their connection? Or, if under no doubt, wherefore do we not endeavor to trace their operation, that we may know how to preserve those advantages we are so eager to obtain? If an inquiry into the causes of the revolutions of nations is more imperfect and less satisfactory than when directed to those of individuals and of single families, if ever it should be rendered complete, its application will at least be more certain. Nations are exempt from those accidental vicissitudes which derange the wisest of human plans upon a smaller scale. Number and magnitude reduce chances to certainty. The single and unforeseen cause that overwhelms a man in the midst of prosperity never ruins a nation. Unless it be ripe for ruin, a nation never falls. And when it does fall, accident has only the appearance of doing what, in reality, was already nearly accomplished. There is no physical cause for the decline of nations. Nature remains the same. And if the physical man has degenerated, it was before the authentic records of history. The men who built the most stupendous pyramid in Egypt did not exceed in stature those who now live in mean hovels at its immense base. If there is any country in the world that proves the uniformity of nature, it is this very Egypt. Unlike to other countries that owe their fertility to the ordinary succession of seasons, of which regular registers do not exist and are never accurate, it depends on the overflowing of the waters of a single river. The marks that indicated the rising of the Nile in the days of the Pharaohs and of the Ptolemies do the same at the present day, and are a guarantee for the future regularity of nature, by the undeniable certainty of it for the past. By a singular propensity for preserving the bodies of the dead, the Egyptians have left records equally authentic with regard to the structure of the human frame. Here nothing is fabulous, and even the unintentional errors of language are impossible. We have neither to depend on the veracity nor the correctness of man. The proofs exhibited are visible and tangible. They are the object of the senses and admit of no mistake. But while that country exhibits the most authentic proofs of the uniform course of nature, it affords also the most evident examples of the degradation of the human mind. It is there we find the cause of those ruins that astonish and the desolation that afflicts. Had men continued their exertions, the labor of their hands would not have fallen to decay. It is in the exertion and conduct of man, and in the information of his mind, that we find the causes of the mutability of human affairs. We are about to trace them through an intricate labyrinth, but in this we are not without a guide. The history of 3,000 years, and of nations that have risen to wealth and power in a great variety of situations, all terminating with a considerable degree of similarity, discovers the great outline of the causes that invigorate or degrade the human mind, and thereby raise or ruin states and empires.
Book 1, Chapter 1.
One of the most solid foundations on which an inquirer can proceed in matters of political economy, as connected with the fate of nations, seems to be by an appeal to history, a view of the effects that have been produced. and an investigation of the causes that have operated in producing them. Unfortunately, in this case, the materials are but very scanty, and sometimes rather of doubtful authority. Nevertheless, such as they are, I do not think it well to reject the use of them, and have therefore begun by taking a view of the causes that have ruined nations that have been great and wealthy, beginning with the earliest records and coming down to the present time. I divide this space into 3 periods, because in each is to be seen a very distinct feature. During the first period, previous to the fall of the Roman Empire, the order of things was such as had arisen from the new state of mankind, who had gradually increased in numbers and improved in sciences and arts. The different degrees of wealth were owing at first to local situation, natural advantages, and priority in point of settlement, till the causes of decline begun to operate on some, when the adventitious causes of wealth and power, producing conquest, began to establish a new order of things. The second period, from the fall of the Roman government till the discovery of America, and the passage to the East Indies by the ocean, has likewise a distinct feature, and is treated of by itself. The rulers of mankind were not then men, who from the ease and leisure of pastoral life under a mild heaven had studied science and cultivated the arts. They were men who had descended from a cold northern climate, where nature did little to supply their wants, where hunger and cold could not be avoided but by industry and exertion, where, in one word, the sterility of nature was counteracted by the energy of man. The possessors of milder climates and of softer manners, falling under the dominion of such men, inferior greatly in numbers as well as in arts, intermixed with them, and formed a new race of which the character was different. And it is a circumstance not a little curious that while mankind were in a state at which they had arrived by increasing population and by the arts of peace, slavery was universal. But that when governed by men who were conquerors and owed their superiority to force alone, where slavery might have been expected to originate, it was abolished. The progress towards wealth in this new state of things was very slow, but the equality that prevailed amongst feudal barons, their love of war and glory, and the leisure they enjoyed, by degrees extended the limits of commerce very widely. As the northern world never could produce many articles which its inhabitants had by their connection with the south learnt to relish and enjoy. The intermediate countries that naturally formed a link of connection between the ancient nations of the east and the rough inhabitants of the north profited the most by this circumstance. And we still find the borders of the Mediterranean Sea, though no longer the seat of power, the places where wealth was chiefly concentrated. The impossibility of the inhabitants of the northern countries transporting their rude and heavy produce, in order to exchange it for the luxuries of the south, gave rise to manufactures as well as fishing on the southern confines of the Baltic Sea, from whence arose the wealth of Flanders, Holland, and the Hanse towns. This forms an epoch entirely new in its nature and description, and its termination was only brought on by the great discovery of the passage to Asia, by the Cape of Good Hope, and to America, by sailing straight out into the Atlantic Ocean. The nations that had till those discoveries been the best situated for commerce no longer enjoyed that advantage. By that means it changed its abode. But not only did it change its abode, it changed its nature, and the trifling commerce that had hitherto been carried on by the intervention of caravans by land or of little barks coasting on the borders of the Mediterranean Sea, never venturing without imminent danger to lose sight of the shore, was dropped for that bold and adventurous navigation, connecting the most distant parts of the world, between which, since then, large vessels pass with greater expedition and safety than they formerly did between the Grecian islands or from Italy to Africa. 3 inventions, 2 in commerce and the other in war, nearly of equal antiquity, formed this into one of these epochs that gives a new feature to things. The discovery of the magnetic power of the needle improved and totally altered navigation. The art of printing gave the means of extending with facility, to mankind at large, the mode of communicating thoughts and ideas, which had till then been attended with great difficulty, and confined to a few. This placed men nearer upon an equality with respect to mind, and greatly facilitated commerce and the arts. The invention of gunpowder nearly at the same time changed the art of war, not only in its manner, but in its effect, a point of far greater importance. While human force was the power by which men were annoyed, in cases of hostility, bodily strength laid the foundation for the greatness of individual men, as well as of whole nations. So long as this was the case, it was impossible for any nation to cultivate the arts of peace, as at the present time, without becoming much inferior in physical force to nations that preferred hunting or made war their study, or to such as preferred exercising the body, as rude nations do, to gratifying the appetites, as practiced in wealthy ones. To be wealthy and powerful long together was then impossible. Since this last invention, the physical powers of men have ceased to occupy any material part in their history. Superiority in skill is now the great object of the attainment of those who wish to excel, and men may devote themselves to a life of ease and enjoyment without falling under a real inferiority, provided they do not allow the mind to be degraded or sunk in sloth, ignorance, or vice. Those discoveries, then, by altering the physical powers of men, by changing their relations and connections, as well as by opening new fields for commerce and new channels for carrying it on, form a very distinct epoch in the history of wealth and power, and alter greatly their nature in the detail. Though, in the main outline and abstract definition, they are still the same, having always the same relation to each other, or to the state of things at the time. This last period is then very different in its nature, and much more important than either of the others that preceded it. Yet, in one thing, there is a similarity that runs through the whole, and it is a very important one. The passions and propensities of mankind, though they have changed their objects and the means of their gratification, have not changed their nature. The desire of enjoyment, and of enjoyment with the least trouble possible, appears to be the basis of all the passions. Hence, envy, jealousy, friendship, and the endless train of second-rate effects appear all to be produced by that primary passion. And as from this originate the wealth as well as the decline of nations, the history of the revolutions in wealth and power during the two first periods are by no means unimportant. Besides, as their duration was much longer than that of the latter, they lead to a more certain conclusion. The review of what has taken place will occupy the first book and serve as a data for an inquiry into the nature and causes of the fall of nations. The first part of the second book will be dedicated to investigating the internal causes of decline, that is to say, all those causes which arise from the possession of wealth and power, operating on the habits, manners, and minds of the inhabitants, as also on the political arrangements, laws, government, and institutions, so far as they are connected with the prosperity or decline of nations. The latter part of the same book will treat of the exterior causes of decline, arising from the envy of other nations, their advancement in the same arts to which the nations that are rich owe their wealth, or their excelling them in other arts, by which they can be rivaled, reduced, or subdued. After having inquired into external and internal causes, and the operation of each and of both, though they never act quite separately, accidental causes will make an object for consideration, which will bring the general inquiry to a conclusion. The third book will begin with an application of the information obtained to the present state of England, by comparing its situation with that of nations that were great, and by endeavoring to point out a means by which its decline may be prevented. Though we know that, in this world, nothing is eternal, particularly in the institutions of man, yet, by a sort of fiction in language, when the final term is not fixed and the end desirable, what is known to be temporary is considered as perpetual. Thus, the contract between the king and the people, the constituent laws of a country, etc., are considered as permanent and of eternal duration. In this case, though the final decline of a nation cannot be prevented, though the nature of things will either, by that regular chain of causes which admits of being traced, or by their regular operation of coincident causes which is termed accidental, sooner or later put an end to the prosperity of every nation, yet we shall not speak of prolonging prosperity, but of preventing decline, just as if it were never to happen at any period. Before entering upon this inquiry, it may be well, for the sake of being explicitly understood, to define what I mean by wealthy and powerful nations. In speaking of nations, wealth and power are sometimes related to each other as cause and effect. Sometimes there is between a mutual action and reaction. In the natural or ordinary course of things, they are at first intimately connected and dependent on each other, till, at last, this connection lessening by degrees, and they even act in opposite directions, when wealth undermines and destroys power, but power never destroys wealth. Though wealth and power are often found united, they are sometimes found separated. Wealth is altogether a real possession. Power is comparative. Thus, a nation may be wealthy in itself, though unconnected with any other nation, but its power can only be estimated by a comparison with that of other nations. Wealth consists in having abundance of whatever mankind want or desire, and if there were but one nation on earth, it might be wealthy, but it would, in that case, be impossible to measure its power. Wealth is, however, not altogether real. It is in a certain degree comparative, whereas power is altogether comparative. The Romans, for example, may very justly be called the most powerful nation that ever existed. Yet a single battalion of our present troops, well supported with artillery, would have probably destroyed the finest army they ever sent into the field. A single ship of the line would certainly have sunk, taken, or put to flight all the fleets that Rome and Carthage ever sent to sea. The feeblest and least powerful of civilized nations, with the present means of fighting and the knowledge of the present day, would defeat an ancient army of the most powerful description. Power, then, is entirely relative, and what is feebleness now would at a certain time have been force or power. It is not altogether so with wealth, which consists in the abundance of what men desire. The Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans had wealth, and this, though perhaps not consisting in the same objects, was perhaps not inferior to ours at the present time. But as wealth, purely and simply, no comparison between different nations was necessary, farther than that men's desires are augmented by seeing the abundance possessed by others, and therefore they become comparative as to wealth. Without, however, entering into a long examination respecting the various possible combinations of wealth and power, which are something similarly connected in states, as health and strength are in the animal body, let both be considered only in a comparative way, the comparison either being made with other nations at the same time or with the same nation at different times. Thus, for example, in comparing the wealth and power of Britain now with what they were at the latter end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, we find that the merchants of Liverpool, during the first 3 years of last war, fitted out a force of privateers equal to the Spanish Armada, and consequently superior to the whole naval force of England at that time. There can be no doubt, then, that both the wealth and power of the nation are increased. Again, if we find that our ships block up the ports of Holland and prevent their navy from venturing to sea, we must conclude that the relative power of the two nations is altered since the time that the Dutch fleet rode triumphant in the River Thames. But if we want to make a comparison between the naval power of England and that of France and Spain, we must not compare it with the strength of their navies in the year 1780, when they bid us defiance at Plymouth, but take things actually as they are at this present time. When a nation is upon an equality with others for wealth, it may be considered as neither deserving the name of a rich or a poor nation, whatever its real wealth or poverty may be. The same thing holds with power. When a nation is merely able to protect itself, but fully equal to that, though unable to make conquests or aggrandize itself against the will of other nations, it may be said to be neither weak nor strong. Thus, for example, Denmark as a nation is upon a par with others, and neither to be called wealthy and powerful, nor weak and poor, though it certainly has both more actual wealth and power than it had in the 8th century, when the Danes burnt London, Paris, and Cologne. Thus, then, with respect to my reasoning, the whole is to be considered as applying to other nations at the same time, and the degree they are above or below par is the measure of wealth and power, poverty and weakness. But, with respect to a nation itself, wealth is comparative in the progression of time. In speaking of power, we compare nations at the same period, and in speaking of wealth, we may either compare a nation with itself at different periods or with others at the same time. We shall not find any example of a nation's becoming less wealthy whilst it increased in power, but we shall find many instances of nations becoming wealthy whilst they were losing their power, though, together with the power, the wealth always, a little sooner or a little later, vanishes away. Sometimes nations owe their wealth and greatness to accidental causes, that, from their nature, must vanish away, and sometimes to causes which, depending upon the nations themselves, may be prolonged. In general, both the two sorts of causes have united to render every nation great that has been distinguished amongst others for riches or power. The causes, then, divide themselves into two of distinct kinds: those which are independent of the nation itself, and those over which it has some degree of influence and control. In early ages, when knowledge was but little advanced, and when the small stock that had been accumulated was confined nearly to a single spot, the first description of causes were the principal ones. Local situation, priority in discovery or in establishment, gave to one nation a superiority over others, and occasioned the accumulation of wealth, and the acquisition of power and territory. As in the early stages of human life, a few years more or less occasion a greater difference, both in physical powers and mental faculties, than any difference of innate genius or adventitious circumstances. So in the early days of the world, when it was young in knowledge and scanty in population, priority of settlement gave a great advantage to one nation over others, and of consequence enabled them to rule over others. Thus the Assyrian and Egyptian empires were great, powerful, and extensive, while the nations that were beyond their reach were divided into small states or kingdoms on the most contemptible scale. Time, however, did away the advantages resulting from priority of establishment. Local situation was another cause of superiority, of a more permanent nature, but this also new discovery has transferred from one nation to another. Qualities of the soil and climate are counteracted by the nature and habits of the inhabitants, which frequently, in the end, give the superiority where there was at first an inferiority. If ever the nations of the world come to a state of permanence, which in all probability will never be the case, it must be when population is nearly proportioned to the means of subsistence in different parts, when knowledge is nearly equally distributed, and when no great discoveries remain to be made either in arts, science, or geography. While the causes from which wealth and power rise in a superior degree are liable to change from one nation to another, wealth and power must be liable to the same alterations and changes of place. So long any equal balance among nations must be artificial. But when circumstances become similar, and when the pressure becomes equal on all sides, then nations, like the particles of a fluid, though free to move, having lost their impulse, will remain at rest. If such a state of things should ever arrive, then the wealth and power would be only real, not comparative. The whole might be very rich, very affluent, and possess great abundance of everything, either for enjoyment or for defense, without one nation having an advantage over another. They would be on an equality. But this state of things is far from being likely soon to take place. Population is far from come to its equilibrium, and knowledge is farther distant still. Russia and America, in particular, are both behind in population, and the inhabitants of the latter country are far from being on a par in knowledge with the rest of Europe. When they become so, the balance will be overturned and must be re-established anew. The great discoveries that have taken place in knowledge and geography have been connected. While navigation was little understood, the borders of the Mediterranean Sea and the islands in it were naturally the first places for wealth and commerce. The discovery of the compass and others that followed rendered the navigation of the open ocean more easy and safe than that of the circumscribed seas. This laid a great foundation for change and discovery. It brought Britain into importance, ruined Italy, Genoa, Venice, etc., and has laid the foundation for further changes still. As for discoveries in arts, it would be bold and presumptuous indeed to attempt to set any bounds to them. Discoveries, however, that alter the relations of mankind very materially are probably near at an end. In arts, they give only a temporary preference. If a method should be discovered to cultivate a field with half the trouble and to double the produce, which seems very possible, it would be a great discovery, and alter the general state of mankind considerably, but it would soon be extended to all nations, as the use of gunpowder has been. New produce, or means of procuring the old more easily, are the things chiefly sought after. Potatoes, coffee, tea, sugar, cotton, silk, distilled spirits are new productions, unknown to the Romans. Glass, gunpowder, printing, windmills, watermills, steam engines, and the most part of spinning and weaving machines are new inventions, but they can be extended to all countries. The mariner's compass changed the relative position of places, and no new invention of the same importance as to its effects on nations probably can take place. Navigation does not admit of a similar improvement to that which it has received. If goods could be conveyed for a quarter of the present price, it would not produce the same sort of effect. To render navigating the ocean practicable was a greater thing than any possible improvement on that practicability. As for new discoveries in geography, they are nearly at an end. The form and the extent of the earth are known, and the habitable regions are nearly all explored. We have then arrived at a state of things where many of the causes that formerly operated on reducing wealthy nations can never again produce a similar effect. But still, there are other causes which operate as they did formerly. Accordingly, wealth and power are very unequally distributed amongst nations at this moment. And in Europe, there is not one nation that is not either rising or on its decline. The purpose of the present inquiry is, by tracing those causes that still continue to operate, to discover how nations that now stand high may be prevented from sinking below their level, a thing to which history shows they have a natural tendency, and which history shews also is attended with very distressing consequences. We do not labor in Utopia on schemes, but in Britain on real business. And the inquiry is, how a nation, situated as this is, and having more than its share of power, importance, and wealth, may prolong their possession? In this inquiry we shall begin with taking a lesson from history, which will serve as some guide. As to the rise of other nations, we neither can nor should attempt to impede that. Let them rise to our level, but let us not sink down to theirs.
Chapter 2.
Without considering the particular causes that have raised some nations greatly above others, there are some general causes of decline which operate in all cases. But even the general causes are not always similar. They vary their way of producing the effect according to circumstances. If a nation excels in arts and manufactures, others acquire a taste for what they make and imitate them. If they excel in the art of war, they teach their enemies to fight as well as themselves. If their territories are large, the unprotected and far distant parts provoke attack and plunder. They become more difficult and expensive to govern. If they owe their superiority to climate and soil, they generally preserve it but a short time. Necessity acts so much more powerfully on those who do not enjoy the same advantages, that they soon come to an equality. In whatever the superiority exists, emulation and envy prompt to rivalship in peace, and to frequent trials of strength in war. The contempt and pride which accompany wealth and power, and the envy and jealousy they excite amongst other nations, are continual causes of change, and form the great basis of the revolutions amongst the human race. The wants of men increase with their knowledge of what it is good to enjoy, and it is the desire to gratify those wants that increases necessity, and this necessity is the spur to action. There are a few natural wants that require no knowledge in order to be felt, such as hunger and thirst, and the other appetites which men have in common with all animals, and which are linked, as it were, to their existence. But while nations satisfy themselves with supplying such wants, there is neither wealth nor power amongst them. Of consequence, it is not into the conduct of such that we are to inquire. Excepting, however, those wants which are inseparable from our existence, all the others are, more or less, fictitious, and increase with our knowledge and habits. It is therefore evident that the nation that is the highest above others feels the fewest wants, or, in other words, feels no wants. She knows nothing that she does not possess, and therefore may be said to want nothing, or which is the same thing, not knowing what she does want, she makes no effort to obtain it. Thus necessity of rising higher does not operate on a nation that sees none higher than itself. At least, it does only operate in a very slender degree. Whereas, in the nation that is behindhand with other nations around, everyone is led by emulation and envy, and by a feeling of their own wants, to imitate and equal those that are farther advanced. Thus it is that necessity acts, but in a very inferior degree on the nation that is the farthest advanced, while it operates in a very powerful way on those that are in arrear. And this single reason, without the intervention of wars or any sort of contest or robbery, would, in the process of time, bring nations to a sort of equality in wealth and refinement. That is, it would bring them all into possession of the means of gratifying their wants. War, excited by the violent and vile passions, by the overbearing pride and insolence of one, and the envy and villainy of another, derange this natural and smooth operation, which nevertheless continues to act in silence at all times and in every circumstance, and which indeed is in general the chief cause of those very disorders by which its operations are sometimes facilitated, sometimes apparently interrupted, sometimes their effect for a moment reversed, but their action never for one instant totally suspended. The desire of enjoyment makes all mankind act as if they were running a race. They always keep the goal in view, though they attempt to be the foremost to arrive at it by various means. But the greatest exertions are never made by those who have got the advance of their competitors. Amongst the wants of mankind, ease is one of very permanent operation, and whenever the necessity of supplying other wants ceases, the desire of supplying that leads to a state of inaction and rest. To seek ease, however, does not imply necessarily to seek total inaction or rest. A diminished exertion is comparative ease, and this is always observable in a state of prosperity, either of an individual or of a nation, after the prosperity has been long enough enjoyed to create a certain degree of lassitude and indifference, which it does on every nation. Whatever may be the accidental circumstance which first raises one nation above others, or the train of adventitious ones that increase for a while and continue that superiority, nothing can be more clear and certain than that they have a natural tendency to come back to a level merely by the exertions of men in the direction of acquiring wealth by industry, and without any of those causes which arise out of war or interrupting the career of each other. When, from the conduct of one nation towards another, or from whatever other cause, war becomes the means by which the superiority of two nations is to be decided, there are many things in favor of the least wealthy nation. It has less to protect and to lose, and more to attack and to gain. The task is much easier and more alluring. There is a sort of energy in attempting to obtain that is not to be found in those who are only exerting themselves to keep, of which it is difficult to explain the cause, but of which the existence is very certain. Where natural strength and the struggle with want is great, as is the case with nations who have made but little progress in acquiring wealth, the contest with a people more enervated by ease and less inured to toil is very unequal, and does more than compensate those artificial aids which are derived from the possession of property. From this cause, the triumph of poorer over more wealthy nations has generally arisen, and in most cases has occasioned the contest to end in favor of the more hardy and poorer people. Of the revolutions that took place in the ancient world, whether operated by degrees or by violence, and suddenly, those may be generally traced as the causes. In those ancient nations, any considerable degree of luxury and military success were incompatible with each other. But, in the present age, the case is greatly altered. Military discipline is not near so severe as formerly, and bodily strength has but little effect, while the engines of war can only be procured by those resources which wealth affords. By this means, the decline of nations is, at least, now become a less natural and slower progress than formerly. The operations of war have now a quite different tendency from what they formerly had, and this effect is produced by the introduction of cannon, and a different mode of attack and defense, to carry on which a very considerable degree of wealth is necessary. In former times, the character and situation of the people, the object they had in view, their bravery and the skill of their leaders, did everything. But now, the skill of leaders and the command of money are the chief objects, for there is not sufficient difference between any two nations in Europe as to counterbalance those. And indeed, except so far as military skill is accidental, it is to be found principally in nations who have a sufficient degree of wealth to exercise it and call it into action. We shall see that the first revolutions in the world were effected by the natural strength, energy, and bravery of poor nations, triumphing over those that were less hardy in consequence of the enjoyment of wealth, until the time of the Romans, who, like other nations, first triumphed by means of superior energy and bravery, and, afterwards, by making war a trade, continued, by having regular standing armies, to conquer the nations who had only temporary levies or militias to fight in their defense. The triumph of poor nations over others in many respects their superiors continued during the Middle Ages, but the wealth acquired by certain nations then was not wrested from them by war, but by an accidental and unforeseen change in the channel through which it flowed. At the same time that this change took place, without the intervention of force, the art of war changed in favor of wealthy nations, but the changes took place by slow degrees, and the power of nations now may almost be estimated by their disposable incomes. This change, however, has by no means secured the prosperity of wealthy nations. It has only prevented poor ones, unable by means of fair competition to do by conquest what they could not effect by perseverance in arts and industry. For in other respects, though it makes the prosperity of a nation more dependent on wealth and more independent of violence, it prevents any nation from preserving its political importance after it loses its riches. It does not by any means interrupt that progress by which poor nations gradually rise up and rival richer ones in arts. It has not done away the advantages that arise from superior industry and attention to business, or from the gradual introduction of knowledge amongst the more ignorant, thereby lessening their inferiority and tending to bring nations to a level. On the contrary, by increasing the advantages and securing the gradual triumphs gained by arts and industry from the violence of war, it makes wealth a more desirable object, and the loss of it a greater misfortune. It tends to augment the natural propensity that there is in poor nations to equal richer ones, although it, at the same time, augments the difficulty of accomplishing their intentions. The superior energy of poverty and necessity which leads men under this pressure to act incessantly in whatever way they have it in their power to act, and that seems likely to bring them on a level with those that are richer, is then the groundwork of the rise and fall of nations, as well as of individuals. This tendency is sometimes favored by particular circumstances, and sometimes it is counteracted by them, but its operation is incessant, and it has never yet failed in producing its effect. For the triumph of poverty over wealth on the great scale, as on the small, though very irregular in its pace, has continued without interruption from the earliest records to the present moment.
This concludes today's reading of An Inquiry into the Permanent Causes of the Decline and Fall of Powerful and Wealthy Nations, by William Playfair. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.